This presentation is for Chapter 4, Cost Management Systems, Activity-Based, Just-in-Time, and Quality Management Systems. In Learning Objective 4, we are going to learn to use activity-based management in a service company. Service companies can also use activity-based management. With regard to indirect cost or overhead costs, the steps are the same for developing overhead allocation rates and applying them to different services or cost objects. So the first step will be to identify activities and estimate their total indirect cost. Second, identify the allocation base for each activity and estimate the total quantity of each allocation base. Third, compute the predetermined overhead allocation rate for each activity. And fourth, allocate the indirect cost to the cost object. So for this example, we are going to use Get Well Hospital. They have decided to use activity-based management to allocate their overhead costs for their patients. As we can see on this slide, in step 1, they identified the 3 activities of admission, procedures, and care and estimated the total overhead costs for each of those activities. In step 2, they identified the allocation base. Remember, the allocation base should be the primary cost driver of the indirect cost. In step 2, they also have to estimate the quantity of the allocation base. For admissions, they identified staff hours and estimated 800 hours as the allocation base. For procedures, they chose tests and estimated 2,500 tests would be conducted. For care, they decided to use nurse hours and estimated 3,000 hours. In step 3, they have determined the predetermined overhead allocation rate by dividing the total estimated overhead cost in step 1 by the total estimated quantity of the allocation base in step 2. So for admissions, the predetermined overhead allocation rate is $100 per staff hour. For procedures, it's $80 per test, and for care, it's $40 per nurse hour. On this slide, we see how these overhead costs were allocated to Henry Whitestone. At the end of each person's stay, the hospital would have an accurate cost of providing health care to the patient. The hospital could use this costing information to make decisions about prices, to charge the patient, evaluate its activities, and look for ways to cut costs. So activity-based management is also useful in other types of service companies, such as accounting firms wanting to know the cost of completing various tax returns, attorneys wanting to know the cost to represent various clients, and cleaning services wanting to know the cost to clean different residential and commercial buildings. And that is the conclusion of the demonstration for Learning Objective 4.